just that I wanted to offer into evidence Ms. Graham's report. So I just do have one short inquiry if the court will allow.
Just one.
Judge, the report is actually hearsay. The doctors testified. I would object to the report.
Any response, Mr. Fedoric?
It's a business record. It's part of her analysis. I'm not sure. I've never had that be an issue as far as a forensic report not being admitted with the scientist's testimony.
Well, some lawyers object and some don't. Mr. O'Farrell has raised the objection. Can I see the report?
Judge, I don't think the witness referred to her report once in her testimony.
Well, and that's what I would have to ask her, and it wouldn't take a minute.
I believe that's what he wanted to do, was to ask her about the report when the jury's brought back in, Mr. O'Farrell. Mr. Fedoric, you can ask your questions of the witness, make your motion to admit the evidence, and I'll decide at that point in time. Mr. O'Farrell, you want to object at that time, you can do so as well.
Thank you, Judge.
All right. All right, we can bring the jury back in now. Please be seated. Mr. Fedoric, I understand you have not concluded with the witness yet. You may continue.
Thank you, Your Honor. Just briefly, Ms. Graham, I forgot that you did prepare a report pursuant to your analysis in this case, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. I'm going to show you that. It's marked People's Exhibit 119 for identification. I'll show you that in a minute. Is that what you do when you do an analysis, a DNA analysis? Is that typically what you do, is prepare a report?
Yes, we're required to prepare a report on all of our analyses.
Okay. And in this particular report, does your lab report, does that reflect the steps that you took in the analysis and the conclusions that you drew?
It includes the general process and then the conclusions, including statistics.
Okay. And does it reflect your testimony today?
Yes, it does.
Okay. So, Ms. Graham, after reviewing People's Exhibit 119 for identification, is that the report that you prepared for this case?
Yes, this is a copy of the report that I prepared.
The people offering to evidence 119, People's 119?
Mr. O'Farrell,
No objection, Judge.
Exhibit 119 will be admitted. Mr. Fedoruk, I take it you're through since you're sitting down.
I apologize, that's all I have.
Okay. Cross-examination, Mr. O'Farrell.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Ms. Graham.
Good afternoon.
The verbal scale on your report, and I'm looking at page 2, indicates this analysis provides a very strong support that Davion Thompson is a contributor to the DNA profile developed for the swabs of laser site, correct?
Correct.
So being a contributor, then we need to determine all of the nuances that you've been describing to the jury about how that DNA made its contribution.
Yeah, we'd like to, but it's almost impossible to really say for sure how it got there or when.
Exactly, okay. So you referred to other members of your team doing a part of this investigation. Who would have developed the sample that was obtained from the site?
Katie Urka, who's a scientist in our lab, I'm her supervisor, actually did the DNA, the laboratory analysis and developed the DNA profiles that I interpreted.
Okay. Is there any quantitative value made of the size of the sample that was obtained?
Yes, that's one of our steps after we extract the DNA, is to quantify how much human DNA is present.
Would that have been part of your role or part of her role?
That was part of her role. But when I took it over, I received all of her data worksheets, so I have access to all of that in my interpretation.
Okay. And after you had provided the report in this case, and I obtained a copy, I had contacted you requesting the worksheets and other data, is that correct?
Correct.
And you were kind enough to email that to me?
Yes.
And would your worksheets be available to you so that you could give us an idea of the quantity of the sample in this case?
Yes, I have a copy of the quantitation results.
Okay.
Is it all right if I refer to them, Your Honor?
Yes.
Could you just tell us what the result was as far as the total DNA sample?
Sure. For the sample on the laser site, it was 0.01227 nanograms per microliter is the concentration. So a nanogram, just for reference, if you know what a milligram is from like medicine and stuff, roughly an idea, that's pretty small. A microgram is 1,000th of that. And then a nanogram is 1,000th of that. So it's a very, very small amount.
And then the other, you concluded there were 2 other contributors?
That would be the total DNA in the whole sample, but that would be divided amongst the 3 contributors, yes.
3 including Mr. Thompson, or a total of 4?
Oh, total of 3.
Okay. And that sample then is the total human DNA of all contributors, right?
Correct. And that was the concentration. So then we put 15 microliters of that into the amplification reaction. So I amped a total of 0.18 nanograms of DNA. Generally, we would target about 0.5 nanograms. So it was a little less than half of what we ideally would want to put into the PCR reaction.
And you had mentioned that part of this process, once you had the known sample of Mr. Thompson, would be quantitatively determining his contribution.
Well,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
you know, and I've been doing this for a long time. So it used to be visually, I would declare a major donor. So when I first visually looked at it, I'm like, I see a major donor, but we do by policy now run it through StarMix and let it come up with those mixture proportions that I was talking about that broke it down and said it was about a 93 to 5 to 2 as the 3 contributors.
Okay, so StarMix is a software program
Correct.
which I guess supplements your own conclusions. It doesn't replace them. Is that correct?
That's correct. The primary diagnostics on the StarMix run is if it's intuitive, if now I look at it and that makes sense to me. If it had come back and said this is a 40 to 20 mixture, I would just said, no, that's not at all what it looks like. But 93 to 5 to 2 was about what I would have visually guessed.
And you talked about the proclivity of DNA to attach itself to things, and it can happen in almost as many ways as you can imagine. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, there's almost an infinite number of possibilities for transferring and removing and redepositing and yes.
Okay. And is that complicated, or at least made more difficult because when the sample is smaller?
Yes, I mean, that's a good point. So DNA can be transferred when it's a larger amount, but it's less likely that you're going to do that without noticing. A blood sample, if you touch liquid blood, you could easily transfer it to something. You're going to see it. So when you get the small amounts of DNA, especially contact, it's invisible to the naked eye. You can't really trace where it's coming from or going to.
Okay. So I could touch an object, and then is it my skin cells that leave the DNA, or what exactly is it about me that then shows up as DNA on the object?
Well, and that's the interesting thing. They're still kind of trying to research that too. They're not sure. It's probably a variety of sources. If anyone who touches their face, there's a lot of, tears, nasal secretions, saliva are all high source of DNA. If you're scratching your skin, you could be removing some skin tissue that way. They do believe that there's sweat that can kind of carry it out of your pores, but there may even be some free DNA in your outer layer of skin. Because remember, your outer layer of skin is kind of dying off. It's constantly renewing itself from the inside. So the outer layer, sometimes there's just DNA that's from old dead skin cells that have gone away. So it's kind of a combination, and they're not real sure. And that's why they say some people may be more prone to leaving their DNA than others, but they're not sure what factors. They've actually found that it seems to be more in men than women, but they don't know why.
And then my DNA can get on an object that I've never even touched, correct?
Yeah, it's possible, yes.
And is that where we get into the concept of transfer DNA? Is that the term that's used?
Yes, well, you can have, it's still considered direct or primary transfer if you say you didn't touch something, but you were coughing over it and your saliva was landing on it. But it can also be transferred there through an intermediary, usually another person, but also it could be from an object. If you've got a sweatshirt you wear every day and you never wash it and it has a lot of your DNA on it, that could possibly contaminate another object.
Is it conceivable that if I had your sweater and I wanted to place your DNA on an object, I might rub your sweater on that object and then that would show your DNA on it?
It could happen. It could be possible. Again, it would depend on how clean the sweater is. Had I just washed it, or again, is it my favorite and I wear it and I never wash it? That's the thing. Almost any scenario is possible.
Okay. And there's really no way to quantify the statistical probability of any of those scenarios. Is that correct?
No, not at the current time. I just read an article in Europe. I think they're trying to do that in someday, but it sounds like kind of a tremendous undertaking to try to develop probabilities for every possible DNA transfer.
So If I understand correctly, what we can say about that gun site is that it had DNA contributions from 3 different people.
There were 3 people in that sample. Yeah.
And the most highest concentration was from Mr. Thompson.
Correct.
But we can't make any comparisons about those 3 as to who actually touched the object.
Right, I can't, I mean, that's the most likely scenario for getting your DNA is if you had direct contact, but it's not the only, correct.
Yeah, okay. And if a person, say the lesser one, had access to an item of Mr. Thompson's clothing or whatever, they might contribute his DNA just as a way of establishing a false probability. Is that right?
Oh, intentionally? I mean, I suppose that's possible, or unintentionally.
Sure. Did you form a conclusion as to whether these 3 contributors were male or female or a combination?
So the major donor, which was consistent with Mr. Thompson, was male. The problem with that is we just see that there's an X and a Y chromosome, but when you have those minor donors, since everybody, male and female, would have an X and only males would have a Y, once I see that big Y from the major donor, I can't tell if the minor types have the Y also or not. So I can't tell if those are male or female.
So okay, fair enough. And you can't tell anything about the sequence of timing as to whether those 3 people touched or contributed at the same time, or who was first, who was last. You can't tell any of that. Is that correct?
You can't tell that for sure. Years ago, I read an article where they did steering wheel swabs, and they found that a lot of the times it was the person who drove it last. They removed the other people's and they left theirs, but not all the time. Sometimes it was variable. So yeah, you cannot definitively give any kind of order or time frame on those contributors.
So just taking your example, if I may, for a moment, of the steering wheel, I'll say maybe typically, I'll use that word, more than one person may drive a car. Would you agree?
Yes, I have 2 daughters, so they drive mine, yeah.
Okay. So based on the mechanism of DNA transfer, it would be likely that all 3 of your daughters would have DNA on your steering wheel.
Yes, most likely I would expect it to be a mixture on my steering wheel of the 3 of us.
And let's say you drove the car 80% of the time, would that necessarily mean that perhaps 80% of the DNA would be yours?
Well, and that's what that study was kind of hypothesizing, that that's how it should work, but they found it was highly variable. That's not necessarily how it works.
And in fact, they're your daughters, but one of them may be a more high contributor than others. That's not necessarily tied to genetics, is it?
Correct. They could be a better shedder, or maybe they just don't wash their hands as often. They could leave more DNA than I do, even if I drive it more. That's possible.
So with all of your expertise and experience and as hard as you've worked on this case, you can't tell the jury whether Mr. Thompson ever touched that gun site, can you?
No, I can only testify that the DNA is consistent with his being on there, but not how it got there.
Thank you, Judge. I have no further questions.
All right. Anything else, Mr. Fedora?
Nothing further, Your Honor. Thank you.
You may step down. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to break for today. And once again, I have to caution you not to discuss the case with anyone or amongst yourselves. And as far as news reports, do not read, listen to, or watch any. Here's the plan for tomorrow. Let's see how this works. Because we kept you waiting today with the technical difficulties, we're going to start tomorrow at 10 a.m. rather than 9 a.m. It's my understanding that the prosecution has 2 more witnesses before they rest their case. And so as soon as we finish those 2 witnesses tomorrow, we're going to break until Monday. So tomorrow could be a very short day. We don't have any more videos or technical issues that I think we have to deal with tomorrow. So that's the plan, to get you in by 10 and get you out by 1. Let's see if I can beat the cleaners time. All right. Anything else for the record, Mr. Fedora?
No, Your Honor.
Mr. O'Farrell?
No, Your Honor, thank you.
We will stand in recess until 10 a.m. Have a pleasant evening, ladies and gentlemen. The record should reflect the jury is not present at this time. Anything else for the record, Mr. Fedora?
No, Your Honor.
Mr. O'Farrell?
No, Your Honor, thank you.
Stand in recess until tomorrow. Also, gentlemen, with regard to jury instructions, they've been completed for the most part since we've tried this case before. There may be a few additions that my clerk will need from you, such as the names of expert witnesses to add to the instructions. We can get that this evening. Maybe we can get the instructions back to you tomorrow. So you have those to look at over the weekend, all right?
And Your Honor, I believe my proposed instructions that I already filed, those have the expert instructions for each individual expert.
Okay. All right, Mr. O'Farrell, if you got any, you need to get to my clerk as well so we can look at those also.